Okay, David, can you hear me? I'm Paul.
Yeah, got you, mate. Yeah.
Super. Okay, so for anybody who doesn't know who you are, do you want to give a quick introduction on yourself and a bit on your career, how you both led to you both end up in Australia and New Zealand, as you're both from Great Britain yourselves, Scotland and England. So just a quick review of your career to date and how you found yourself in Australia, New Zealand.
Yeah, I'll kick us off. So, yeah, originally from Scotland, as you'll probably pick up quite quickly from the accent. I moved out to New Zealand in 2006. So my wife's a Kiwi girl, so that was what brought me out here. I was lucky enough. I studied through Edinburgh University in the late 90s, and then played rugby. And I was fortunate to play a few years on the World Sevens Circuit Series for the Scottish team, and that kind of got me a good exposure into the Scottish Institute of Sport and some high performance coaching and training systems in that sevens environment, and that really grabbed my sort of attention, and I loved it. So I was fortunate at a couple of opportunities to start working part-time in sport with in football and rugby during those sort of early 2000s. And then my first big break was I got a role at Exeter Chiefs down in England in 2005. So I was working in a full-time environment as the head S&C. It was a great opportunity, sort of first full-time gig and actually leading a programme, albeit in Division 1 in England, but still with full-time players. And then 2006 moved out to New Zealand and spent 2 or 3 years working up in Taranaki, one of the provincial unions in New Zealand. And in 2009 moved down to the Hurricanes down in Wellington, and started off as an assistant S&C for a couple of years, and then moved into the head S&C role, and then the last couple of years the job probably just changed slightly to more of a head of physical performance role with a couple of really good operators working in the department with me in the strength and conditioning space. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
That's perfect, Davie. Paul?
Yeah, so as you can gather, I'm from Northern England. So I grew up playing rugby league and soccer in a town called Widnes, just outside Liverpool. And from there, I was very lucky to have a professional career. I played rugby league when I was growing up, but I was offered a contract at Sale Sharks a couple of years after rugby union had gone full-time professional in the UK. And at 17, went straight into a full-time environment. It was a little bit different back then in rugby union. Probably wasn't anywhere near as professional, or it absolutely wasn't anywhere near as professional as it is now. But I was lucky to go into a good club with good people. I was pushed very hard very early. Went from there back to rugby league and played in Super League for 2 years, and then probably had the best time of my life moving over to Ireland, where I had 3 years at Munster as a player, and we had some real success there. I was in a team full of absolute superstars, but more importantly, great people, really, really good, impressive coaches. And I learned an awful lot there about high performance. From there, moved over to France and experienced French rugby, playing in the top 14, which was a little bit different. And probably pushed me straight into strength and conditioning as an interest, because in my experience there wasn't a whole lot done for me around that space in comparison to the league teams I played at, and specifically in the European Cup and Celtic Cup with Munster. So that's where I started getting interested in strength and conditioning. I'd had a few knee injuries at this point, a couple of knee reconstructions, and so I had a bit of time on my hands and started studying. A really good guy, Alex Natera, who's at GWS Giants now, helped me get onto a Masters of Strength and Conditioning at St Mary's in Twickenham, which was enormous, because that gave me the kind of academic background and ability to study, something that I was really interested in. I was getting lots of practical experience rehabbing myself, and training some of the foreign guys over in the French team. And from there, similar to Dave, I went down and I was in Cornwall, just a bit further past Exeter, where Davie was, and I played there for 3 years. Again, got more and more injuries, and was lucky enough to be given a job down there, helping rehab players. I think I'd had so many injuries, they thought he must know a bit about rehab by now. And so I did rehab down there for a couple of years. I was doing as much strength and conditioning work for free for anybody that I could, for any team that I could, for a kind of long time, really, probably 2 or 3 years at this point. Contacted Kelvin Giles and asked him if he'd be a mentor for me. And really what that was a guide and someone to assist me with my learning journey, direct me down the right paths. And he really helped me. I was lucky enough to get a job, the assistant coach from the team I was playing for in Cornwall. Got a job up at Doncaster Knights rugby union team in the second tier of English rugby. And I went up there I was called the head of S&C, but the truth is I was the only S&C. So I did everything up there. And again, that was a great grounding for me, working incredibly long hours. But I loved it. And I realised I'd found my passion. I retired from playing. And then luckily, again, I've been very lucky. I went from there to Hull FC in Super League and did a couple of years there, which was a great experience, obviously managing people then, not just doing everything on my own. Had some great staff there. And then I had a bit of a crossroads. I had an option to go over back to Munster Rugby as the head of fitness there, but also had a chance to go to Melbourne Storm. And I'd always wanted to live in Australia. Playing rugby league growing up, I'd spent a lot of time here, and I chose the option. My family were behind it, and we came over and moved to Melbourne. Spent a year at the Storm. Again, everybody knows about that place. It's just a phenomenal organisation. Improves year on year is the key for those guys, I think. I went from there I got offered a job as a head of performance at Parramatta Eels. So I went there, spent a couple of years at Para, thoroughly enjoyed that, and then got a similar position at South Sydney Rabbitohs. I was convinced to go there by really good head coach at the time, and some of the senior players who I spoke to. There was a real English influence over there. And Sam Burgess, the Burgess boys that I just really wanted to be involved in. I thought they had a big future. Spent 2 years there. We had a change of coach midway through. And then the change of coach happened to be a friend of mine from Melbourne Storm, Anthony Seibold, who moved up to Brisbane Broncos last year and offered me the opportunity to come up to Brisbane and complete my 4-step journey up the east coast of Australia. And here I am landed at the Broncos in my second year here now. So it's been quite a journey.
Indeed, that's great. Brilliant. Seeing the fact that you both have, playing experience, and now you're in effectively the other side of the fence, must be interesting to go from one to the other. But yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so there is a few questions in already, and then they're going to keep on coming in. So just to everyone in the chat, by all means, you can continue to add the questions as they come. I think the first one's kind of a topical one. It's to do with the current circumstances that we are experiencing in regards to sport and the restrictions that are in place upon us. So it just says, discussing the impact of the coronavirus on your training and what approach you both have adopted as are in more advanced situations with regards to potential return to training and matches and the rest of the world. So NRL kickstarting in next week, I believe, and then New Zealand recently restricting, alleviating the alert level from level 4 to level 3. What does that mean? How does it allow you to move on for? You might not know exactly, but just an insight in terms of how you've been controlling the boys in this period.
Yeah, I'll kick off, Dave. So I think everyone's been in the same boat. It was completely crazy and catastrophic initially. The general assumption in the NRL was that when it first happened, was that we wouldn't be back until September 1 at best. And so our initial plan was to send the players away for a month. We didn't hand out equipment like some teams did. We sent them away, and we told them to take the first 7 days as a break. We didn't send any training to them, and we just kind of took a breath, and things were changing hourly, if not daily. It would significantly impact the amount of training they could or couldn't do. Fast forward, I think it's been about a month now. We've just found that we've had to become really creative. I think communication, particularly at our club, I've been really impressed with the way management have communicated with the players and the staff. It's really important that the players and the staff, because they're just as important, we're all people going through a bit of a crisis together. Everybody was given specific information at the time that they needed it. So not gossip, as you'll see in the NRL, there's significant gossip on the TV and in the newspapers every day. It's important that we dealt with the facts. So the club have done a great job with that. From a performance perspective, what we've done is we've kept in contact with the players. It's really important that we keep a connection. So as a staff, we really did that through our WhatsApp groups, through phone calls. We have duty of care groups. So each member of coaching staff has 5 or 6 players who they keep in contact with. That's our kind of wellness check every day. So we've been in touch with those guys most days, really. and then positional coaches will contact their guys as well and just check how they're going. With regards to training, we've just had to be really creative like every other team. The players have been able to access gym equipment through their gyms or the homes that they're living in. I've got gyms in, or all sorts of different things. From a running point of view, it's been a little bit easier, and I've set the programs, and the players have gone out and completed them and sent me back their feedback. I've dropped in different tests along the way, different running tests, different max efforts and things like that, just to hold them accountable during that period. And with regard to the game starting again, David, just to finish off, I think our expectation is that we'll return to training on Monday, but it is just an expectation at the moment. It's not guaranteed until the National Cabinet meeting, I think, is on Friday. But we certainly got our fingers and our toes crossed that we'll be back to full-time training with the group on Monday. I think we'll all come back with a sense of appreciation for what we do for a living when we return, I'll tell you that.
Well said, well said. No, that's perfect. And David?
Yeah, certainly some similarities with Devs and some things we did slightly differently as well. So when we first went into the level 4 lockdown, we were very similar. We gave the guys a week just to sort of decompress and make sure everything was okay in their homes and get themselves set up. And we were really conscious that we didn't want to inundate the guys with training information as soon as the country had gone into this really uncertain period. And we looked at that human factor, which I think is really, really important. Since then, we've really tried to keep our players informed of the situation. So we have weekly group calls with myself and a coach and one of the other trainers and a coach on with different positional groups. And we've really taken the mindset of what can we do. So everyone acknowledges it's been a really challenging period of time, and it still is to some degree. But we can either be really negative in that, or we can just find ways to make it work. And you know, we sort of have a philosophy that we talk to the guys about and try to get buy-in, that we want them to return to team training whenever that is in time. We wanted them to come back healthy, and we wanted them to come back robust and strong, fast and fit, and in shape, so body weight and body comp. And that was kind of our goals. If we return to team training at some point in time and we can achieve that, the player will add value both individually and collectively. So that's been a big driver. We've presented a lot of information to the players around how we're progressing training through different levels. So we've just come out of level 4, we've moved into level 3, which doesn't really change much at all, really, from a sporting sense in terms of what training we can do. It's all still remote, and we know we're going to be in this period for a minimum of 2 weeks. So we've sent out information, had follow-up calls with guys to say the objectives of each phase are, so for example, level 4, there was an emphasis on getting our max velocity exposures, some aerobic running, and we had strength sessions that were designed with guys that have got full gym setups at home, guys that had some equipment, all the way to guys who were stuck in a place with absolutely nothing. So we've had a whole variety of gym sessions and bodyweight workouts that have been designed and video links sent to the guys, so they can hopefully try and maintain strength and, where possible, muscle mass, regardless of the sort of training environment that they find themselves in. And then as we move through the levels, the focus is just changing slightly. So now we're in level 3, the running, the conditioning demands that we're setting guys are becoming slightly more specific, prepare us for level 2, which might be some form of assembly, and then we can get more and more specific as we work back through towards playing games. So that's been our approach. We've combined work with the coaches as well, so it's not just been all physical. We've had some really low-level generic skills drills sent out to players. We've had balls sent out to guys, so they've just been doing basic eye-hand coordination type trainings. But as we go through levels 3 and 2, we're introducing more and more position-specific exercises. So, for example, like our line-out jumpers, they're now getting into some jump land work. So, preparing them for when we get back to full team training, and there'll likely be a pressure to get games played relatively quickly after this period. So, we're looking at likely a 3-week training period before we play our first game. So we know there's going to be pressure in that time there to get things like our line out sorted, or our scrum sorted, or our defence or our attack strategies. So we try to really do everything that we can do, everything that we can do through levels 4, 3 and 2. We're aiming to do that, and then when we get to level 1, that will free up the training time to do things that we can't currently do. So, you know, for example, proper lineouts or scrums, but we've certainly prepared as well as we can for that type of thing. And I suppose that, you know, finally we've had lots of information going out to players around their mental well-being, their nutrition. So our nutritionists been in touch with players, and we don't want players just taking the easy option and maybe just living off tins of baked beans or spaghetti, but they're actually still got the opportunity to grow their cooking skills and eat healthily, and, you know, keep body weight and body composition on target. So lots of kind of different information sources going back into the players, all with those kind of overriding objectives of coming back to team assembly in good condition.
100%. With it being such an unknown, thank you for providing that information. I'm sure there's coaches around, sports scientists, S&Cs around the world, you know, thinking of these steps, and it's good to hear some input from people on this side of the world where things are possibly progressing. But again, we don't know. But thank you. That leads us nicely on to a question on, okay, so prescribing load. So what methods do you use to prescribe and monitor physical load, both on the field and in the gym? So maybe we'll start with the gym maybe, and then progress it onto the pitch. So what that?
Yep, I'll kick us off. And there's in the gym, like, we're relatively simple. We prescribe fairly off a percentage of a predicted 1 rep max. We have some formula to sort of predetermine approximate loads. You know, for example, based off a bench press predicted 1 rep max, we can try and predict, for example, of what a dumbbell bench press might look like. So our gym programs are based off a percentage system in the main. We do know that there's pros and cons with that system. I generally quite like it because it does give guys a ballpark load to lift, and we've just invested in some push bands at the start of this season, so now we've got a little bit more exposure to some velocity based training. So we're currently looking at that around some in a competitive environment. We have certain tasks that we do each week when we're assembled to create a competitive spirit where all the guys are basically doing a similar movement. For example, a 60 or 70 kg push press, and just making that competitive. But we're slowly looking at using the VBT for if we're in speed strength phases or strength speed phases, and we have more advanced or stronger lifters that we want to be a little bit more specific with, setting velocity thresholds to lift, and allowing those guys to then obviously adjust their loads up or down to try and hit those velocity bands. So with our Excel system that we use in our gym programs, we can track volume load and things like that in the background, but relatively simple from the gym side of things. And then on the field, we're just looking at some key metrics really. So we do keep track of things like total distance, but we look a lot at HMLD, and you know, Brett's just covered off that. The sort of theory behind that, we use that as an intensity marker for us, where we have certain targets set for different sessions. We also do look at acceleration impulse, and that came off some work we did with Jace Delaney around his average acceleration metric, and using that around more intensive conditioning drills or technical tactical drills. We'll use that as a marker or a gauge of the intensity. We do track acceleration and decelerations a little bit more in the background. Max velocity exposures, we set that at 85% of the individual's maximum speed, so that's done it on a relative scale. And then a little bit more around games and things as well. We look at repeat efforts and collisions. So yeah, that would sort of be a summary of our on-field and gym-based tracking.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, so Me to go, Dave?
Yeah, Paul, sorry, yeah, carry on. Thank you.
So our strength coach, Ryan Whitley, is very specific. I won't actually go into the detail he does. He'll do it significantly better than me. But we have a strength diagnostics program. I mean, we're talking things around the force plate. We also use gym aware. I think we've got 6 gym awares down there. So the programming generally is based around 1 RMs, but we're also using bar speeds depending on the focus of the day. We do use tactical periodization here, so we have a specific focus from a movement perspective on each day, and then Ryan will work with me to tailor the program to make sure that we're not training competing qualities on the field compared to the gym. That's our primary focus there. Rep sets, gym volume is done. We have a strength scientist here completing a PhD, Kellyanne Redmond, who tracks and quantifies the load that the boys are completing in the gym. Some of her PhD is focusing on strength decay, which we've got particular interest in and around the off-season period. Big believers that the more the players can spend time in the football program, the better, and developing general qualities as opposed to being able to get a little bit more specific, a bit like Brett spoke about earlier, is a real focus of our program. So strength decay in that period, and similarly in the mandatory 2-week period off during Christmas has been a focus of Kellyanne's research. But further to that, when you get situations like this, may not happen ever again, but where you get COVID-19 kicking and your players are away for 4 weeks, it's going to be interesting to see the effect that has had. We've got DEXA scans on all the players this week to have a look at how much muscle mass may or may not have been lost, and the obvious increases in fat mass that we're expecting to see when players don't reduce their calorific input compared to their outputs. As regards to field then, we use our GPS obviously for quantifying the basics, as I imagine everybody does, in around high-speed running load, number of sprints. Max velocity is a really important measure to track. We don't measure max velocity on a running track or in a flat-out sprint. We only monitor and measure max velocity as the game speed max velocity. The number of sprint meters done in each session, accelerations, decelerations, and then obviously the training load is monitored around the progression of each of those and how much they're overloaded by each week. But primarily our load is consistent around, we're very consistent with our load. Our coach and the coaching staff work towards a very specific game model. And the game model, then one of our best metrics is number of minutes on field. Because we know that the content of those minutes is very specific around the game model, and then we have the intensities attached to each of those elements of the game model. So may seem simple, but the acceleration impulse and the peak periods analysis that we go through is a big determinant on how much time we spend on field.
Perfect, that's perfect. And in that regard then, just a pre-season and in-season kind of question with regards to speed. So how many percentage or certain max velocities exposures would you prescribe in pre-season and in-season, and is it position specific?
Also, from my perspective, in the NRL, it's hugely position specific. I'll give you an example. So an outside back, and it's person specific as well. So I've worked at a number of clubs in the NRL, so it gives a nice sort of a nice flavour of them. And you've got different types of winger, for example. So some wingers can get between 10 and 15 sprints above 90%. Some wingers will get 4. Positionally, hookers find it very hard, for example, chasing rucks constantly and play the balls. They find it very hard to get exposures above 90%. So from a dose perspective, it's position and person specific. But really, I use a bit of coaching license there to look at the quantity we need. We obviously look at the worst case the players are exposed to, what's the max number of sprints they're exposed to, how are they feeling, how many have they done in the last week, all those sorts of things. But if I was to give you a general number, it would be 3 to 4 exposures over 90% a week, and we monitor that. I've been using the Watch app. I was lucky enough to test it for the guys at STATSports. I've been using the Watch app, and one of the key things I found with that is both the ability to set thresholds, but also the ability to monitor 8 players on the watch at a time. That's been, you know, fantastic in and around testing players and making sure that they are getting that. It's a bit of a challenge. Using the live app can help too, but it's a bit of a challenge when we tend to get our high speed exposures, our max above 90% max velocity exposures in the mechanics section of our 15-minute warm up, if you like. And so it's been really important that we can track that. We don't want to get to the end of the session and realize that they haven't hit them and try and start hitting it then when they're under fatigue. We prefer to get it at the start of the session. So that's been helpful for us. But I'd say between 3 and 4 exposures pre-game per week would be our kind of average, if you like.
Yeah, relatively similar for us. Certainly position specific. There's a huge variance in the builds of some of our guys. You know, ranging from an 80 kg halfback to a 132 kg prop. So, and their positional roles are quite different. So, in the pre-season, we'll try and look at 2 speed sessions in a week. Generally, one of those is a bit more linear and max velocity focused, and one a bit more change of direction, reactive agility focused. And obviously, we just progress the intensities across the pre-season. So we ultimately will try and build up for some positions like our outside back, something in the region of 5 to 6 exposures. We use 85% of max velocity, so building up towards 5 to 6 exposures. We can see games where some players, depending on the nature of the game, obviously they may get 4 or 5 exposures in a game, but we also have guys in the front row who might have no exposures. So we know that those guys don't really have to sprint long distances. So if we're doing any linear speed work with those guys, with our big boys up front, we tend to cap it at about 20 metres, and occasionally they'll get maybe 1 or 2 speed exposures. But with our guys who do run quickly, often we start our count of their max velocity exposures from the previous game. So, you know, if a guy gets 4 exposures in the previous game, and we're looking to try and get him to 5 or 6 for the week, when we do our speed work on typically a Tuesday morning, we may look at getting 1 or 2 exposures for that guy to get him back to 6 for the week, and then we'll start the count again from the following week. So we try and have a double-pronged attack with the speed. One is run fast to try and help us get faster, and obviously secondly from that injury prevention angle, which has been, you know, quite well publicised and researched, that one of the best methods to protect against injury and running fast is to actually run fast and use that sweet spot of exposures. So yeah, it just depends on the position and then the individual within that as well. And then obviously some weeks you're challenged. Guy may have a niggle, he may have a knock, and he maybe can't train till Thursday or something like that. So you just have to roll with the punches, and then you just have to use your coaching intuition and your experience to see how you're going to build that guy back up the following week. I think that's just, you know, part of the job, but a bit of the art and the science to that part.
David, I can't help myself. I can't help myself.
Okay.
Can I just want one question? Can I ask both of you? That's really interesting, this whole notion of percentage max velocity exposures. So you guys have obviously had a lot of experience with this. It works for you and all that sort of stuff. Can you just give us a couple of minutes on why you've chosen the amount of exposure and these metrics, say 90% versus 85% or whatever you're using? Is there a chance that we get a couple of minutes from each of you just talking us through the why? So you've talked about the how, but why you've chosen those measures?
Yep.
David, it's really interesting at 3 to 4 above 90%. That's really interesting.
Our rationale when we first started looking at our max velocity work a few years ago, we did used to look at distance covered above the threshold. I can't remember if we had it 85 or 90%. This was a few years ago now. Then I can't remember the research we looked at, but we did decide, we debated a long time around this cut-off point, and I think it's a fair point, Brett, to go, is it 90%? Is it 95%? Is it 85%? What we felt was with 85%, that if you run faster than 85%, obviously you might run at 85, 86, you might run at 90, 92% of max velocity. But in my head and in the guys I work with, we thought if you get to above 85%, you've run pretty quickly. We don't know if it's 100%. We can now track obviously the peak velocity using the live system on the STATSports, which helps. But we just felt that if you set the threshold at 90% and you only reached 89% of your max velocity, you wouldn't qualify as an exposure. But within our environment, we still felt that you'd run quickly. So hence using 85 almost as like the lowest point where we feel that you've run relatively quickly. So that was kind of our justification for that. In terms of moving to exposures, again, it was just more an observation what we felt fitted that environment, and rather than one guy maybe doing a long sprint effort where he chalks up, let's just say 35 or 40 meters above the threshold you're using. We felt that from a muscular tissue and a nervous system sort of demand that the frequency of the amount of exposures they have to that intensity of running was something that we'd prefer to track. We do track the distance covered, but only in the background now. Our initial look is always at the number of exposures, and we just again felt that a guy who has say 4 or 5 or 6 exposures, we know that he's exposed himself to running pretty quickly 3 or 4 times, so there's got almost like a tolerance building to going up that quickly, which we felt we didn't quite see if all we knew was that guy had covered 30 meters, say, above the threshold. That was kind of our thinking. Does that kind of answer that question, Brett?
Yeah, that's really good. That's interesting. Thanks, mate. Thanks for sharing that.
Just in tune with that, we have a question here that kind of goes into the kind of composition of those entries and exposures. So it's coming from Matt. He talks and says, you all speak about the number of exposures above 90% or 85%. Can you speak to distance relative to exposure and decisions around that? Obviously, the physiological cost and subsequent management of 4 exposures totaling 10 meters is much different to 2 exposures totaling 50 meters. So kind of it ties into that kind of high-speed running intensity idea of maybe a return to play might achieve those high-speed running distance quite easily in a linear fashion, whereas something more in a training scenario might be completely different. So I'm just wondering if that makes sense, and can you talk on that for a little bit?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. So just to be clear, we're game model first approach. And so wherever possible, we're looking to get our exposures to above 90% in our training. Now, clearly, on a game day -4, game day -2 approach to a 7-day turnaround, which is what we use, we get limited opportunities. We're also limited by time on field. We don't train for long periods, I don't think, because we try and keep our intensity of training really high. And now it's two-sided in that respect, in that it's great because the high intensity often delivers speed exposures that are specific to the game, which is what I'd prefer to get. In the instance that, say, we don't get those on a GD -4, we're certainly going to go after them in a GD -2 pre-field when we're getting ready for the field session. As generally, if they're controlled, obviously if they're in the game, they're different and they're position specific. Periods or distances above 90% or sprint distances. But when they're in the controlled environment, we're pretty simple here. It's over 40 meters. Players build up over 20 and hold for 20. It's as simple as that. We standardize it at that. The expectation, if they haven't run quickly and we need them, we feel like we need them to, and there's a bit of coaching license there as well, based on our experience and the data around how often they sprint in games, the players' history with injury, the players' recent sprint exposures. They all come into our decision that at times we make as a staff that we want them to run quickly, because we feel like they haven't enough based on the data that we've got on them. But absolutely, make no mistake, there's times where we're crossing our fingers, where we're thinking we need them to run fast here because they haven't recently. But if they don't, we think they're at a greater risk of injury. but ideally we're trying to get it in a game-specific environment. That's the point I wanted to make.
That's really good. Okay, so we have a question on testing. So the question is, which tests for running do you choose for on the field, and how many times per season? And then I might tie that in with another testing-based question, which asks, do you test under fatigue? And if so, or is it safe, or do you think it's safe to test under fatigue? And how and when, if so?
Okay, I'll take that one. So, regards testing, I'm going to take this as field testing. We test a 1.2K time trial, 12 lengths of the field. Again, super simple. And we do the VIFT when the players return. And we look at both those numbers. We have standards that we kind of expect, and then we'll do that again once in the pre-season. And I see those tests pretty much as developing the engine and the tyres of the racing car, to use an analogy. And from there, when they hit the specific fitness targets that we expect there, what we want is to be able to practice race scenarios. And that's the way our training is developed with myself and the head coach. We want to be practicing at the specific end of the scale as much as possible. And so what we use is the acceleration impulse that we've spoken about. We measure the peak periods of games from 1 minute to 10 minutes. And then we'll do that not just specific to the position, but specific to the player. And from there, we'll set what we call, or we think is the game intensity. And the reason why we use that as our game intensity marker is because all of the elements and actions within our game model that is specific to the way that our head coach wants us to play the game. It's not to say it's the only way or the best way, but it's the way that we want to prepare our players to give them the best chance of performing. All of the actions within that game model require a change of pace. And the acceleration, the instantaneous accel impulse metric, or essentially velocity, and monitoring that over the last 2 or 3 years as we have done, we feel is the best representation of the players fulfilling the movement demands that we expect based on our game model. So really that very much is our training intensity marker and training intensity management tool. And so with regard to testing, that every session is a test for us, in that there'll be specific blocks and they'll be periodized over the preseason, and then they'll be planned also bearing in mind our time between games in season and also our travel arrangements in season. But absolutely every training session, there'll be an element in that training session where, whether it's running fast, that's a test, in above 90% in the mechanics warm-up, because you haven't done recently, but there'll be periods of training blocks that we consider tests really, or standard checks. Are you able to maintain this intensity of movement within the constraints of the game or drill that we've planned for you? Then clearly there's a more important side to that. Once they've hit that threshold of intensity, is that, are you executing the skills required by the head coach and the assistant coaches to be able to execute the strategic side of our game model whilst you're at the threshold of intensity that is what we consider game speed. So that really is our test. I'm not a fan of the approach of, okay, we've done a fitness test and he's improved his VIFT, for example, by 2 levels in February. How will that help in September? Like, do we need to check that in his fitness in August to check that he's able to play in September? So I much prefer the approach of measuring the intensity that they play in the game. But the other side that's really important to mention on that, and it's a caveat to what I'm saying really, is that intensity doesn't equal successful performance. So the intensity is a threshold measure. What we're doing there is 2-pronged. We're making sure that they're prepared for the worst case scenario, so they're training at or above game speed or game intensity. But the key is then that they execute at that intensity, because I'm a really big believer that strength and conditioning can't win a competition for you, but it can absolutely cost you a competition. And I think that fits in nicely with the approach of making sure that players are able to execute at the intensity required. But the key is in the execution. You can't win it with just intensity alone, I think. I'm not sure what Davie thinks on that.
No, I like that. Maybe a bit of context to the testing. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a great, that last point that Dev's made. There's I'm a huge believer in that. You know, if we go back to the original testing question, we use a 1.2k shuttle run test, or the Bronco as it's quite commonly known in New Zealand. So a 20, 40, 60 metre shuttle 5 times as quick as you can. And we use the yo-yo IR level 1 as our kind of, I look at those as capacity tests, and they basically tell us the same things. When you have a look at the correlation between the outputs in games and those fitness tests, all they're really doing is giving you a global indicator of a guy's capacity. We do some on-field speed testing. You know, we look at a 5, a 10, and a 20 metre acceleration for the tight forwards, and then up to 30s for loose forwards and backs. And we've just been exploring sub-maximal heart rate testing early in our training week, just a 4-minute sub-max heart rate test, which would be classified as a test, obviously, but that was interrupted with the COVID. But it's definitely really, like, once a player to me demonstrates he has the underlying physiological capacity, then it's all about the specificity of that movement. Can he fulfil the demands of his role? And in rugby union, maybe this is maybe slightly different to rugby league. You know, that there is obviously elements of the game that are different. So, for example, the scrum, there's a massive sort of isometric contraction element for some forwards that you don't necessarily get. There is a scrum, so the running output in league will be a little bit higher than in union. But ultimately, whatever that physiological demand on the player is, he is a rugby player, and his job is to execute his role technically and tactically, regardless of the demands of the game. So if he's prepared to, from a physiological perspective, to meet the hardest moments of the game, the key is, can he do that effectively? Can he still communicate? Can he still make good decisions? Can he still execute a certain skill set under those fatiguing conditions? And we're similar to Devs. We've done some work in the past, and when we look at the footage of games and their highest outputs against acceleration impulse, or at the time we were using average acceleration, which is, you know, pretty much the same. You can see that is it's almost an indicator of a really good indicator of when moments of the game are very hard. Acceleration impulse and average acceleration is high, and you can see skill breakdown potentially occurring at those moments of the game. So the question you have to ask yourself, and again, that's probably a little bit of the art and the science, is it an underlying physiological capacity issue causing those mistakes? And if it is, potentially you can have an argument for removing the guy and giving him a physiological stimulus. But is it just an exposure to the executing skill under those fatigue conditions at that intensity? And if it is, then training exposure, you know, conditioning games, that's got to actually develop the skill set to allow that guy to be successful in terms of his rugby performance, not just necessarily chasing an improved yo-yo test, but he still can't deliver technical and tactical excellence when it's required.
I think you both hit the nail on the head there in regards to the use of testing, but then just to appreciate the contextual matters that are involved in the game itself. And but yeah, brilliant. Next one, we've talked a lot about speed for a moment, but just on collisions and the physical component of rugby league and rugby union. Interesting one here. How do you train for collisions, and do you feel that momentum coming into the tackle or coming into the collision itself is a trainable aspect in your program with regards to winning that contact tackle?
Yes, it's certainly in union anyway. The collisions, you know, it's very, very important, and generally the team that wins that collision will get on top in a lot of instances. So there's obviously a huge, there's an interesting question around the momentum and winning collisions, and there's a huge number of components factored into that. You know, there's physiological aspects, you know, around maybe the acceleration rate or the ability to change direction, but there's other contextual factors as well. You know, what the ball carrier inside you is doing. your mindset going into that collision. Is it to win the collision? Is it to power through the collision? Is it to get to the gain line? Is it to get past the gain line? So we certainly try and train that from a purely physical perspective. We do obviously try and improve players' acceleration ability. So we do, for example, resisted acceleration using run rockets or weighted sleds to try and improve that player's ability to accelerate. Now, there's also those other factors to consider. So we tend to try and blend our sessions when we're doing speed sessions, if you'd like to call them that. There's an element of flow to that session. So we may start with acceleration mechanics and then drop into some resisted acceleration work, but then we'll move into drills that have a number of contextual factors built into them, and that hopefully allows players to grow a skill set around timing the run, the movement pattern to find a weak shoulder, how to reorientate their body when it's been knocked off balance through the tackle or the impact with one player or two players or three players, the ability to reorientate and then get into some form of acceleration pattern to try and punch through and out the back of that contact, but still with the ability to, if it's a big contact, that they can still get to ground and present the ball but not held up. And then obviously even prior to contact, what are they doing? So as they come towards that collision, are they still a threat? So are they still a run threat, but are they still a pass threat as well? So there could be a little tip option on the outside to support player, or there could be a release out the back door to another player. So there's a whole number of factors that we try and train, and obviously we do a lot of that in conjunction with our coaches. So I think for me, yes, I think if you have the ability to improve a player's acceleration ability, then potentially you can carry more momentum into that contact. But there's a huge number of other factors as well that I think are of equal importance in my mind around, just I've touched on a few of the examples already, and I don't think it's just as easy as saying, okay, we'll do some accelerations with some weighted sleds, and that's got to let us win momentum, let us win the collision. It's more complex than that, and we try and address as many of those factors as we can when we're targeting that type of development in our trainings.
Absolutely. And then compared to then rugby league, where the collision is somewhat, can be a little bit different, but in terms of how they come up against the player, kind of forces that they're engaged in and to overcome. I'd be interested to see as well how that's kind of progressed in the program, because it's a fascinating area, and it's, as Davie mentioned, there's a lot of contextual matters that can be brought up, and I'm just wondering if you can kind of give us an insight there as well. Cheers.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I'll give you an insight into the elements of our attack game model. Some of the elements are create momentum, apply pressure, and then capitalize on the pressure that you've applied. So it's a good way of looking at how do the whole staff work together, I think. Clearly, as Dave says, when you're carrying the footy, the more acceleration ability you've got for your body weight, the better, because you're going to carry more force into a collision. But I totally agree with him. It's completely different. But an example being, if you look at for our group, you can't look, but we did, the correlation between the 1 rep max squat of our squad and the speed of the play the ball over 2 seasons. There's a really high correlation, or a relatively high correlation there, that the stronger guys lower limb have quicker play the balls. But when you think about what makes up in attack the elements of a quick play the ball, you can see how we can try to train specific, but being more general and then being specific with the skill element becomes really important. So it starts with acceleration into contact. So on the ball, our players, you'll see in rugby league, get the ball and often just run as hard as they can. But then a really important key is late footwork. So being able to find a weak shoulder or find a gap to poke their head through. From there, obviously, we need aggression. Aggression's a difficult quality to train. It's probably easier to recruit. But certainly as they get to the point of collision, it's really important that from an upper body, I suppose, but full chain perspective, they're able to create space by using their bumper bars, as we call them, or their elbows and forearms to create space between the attacker and the defender. And in our game, the reason why they want to create space like that at contact is so that they can find the floor. If they can find the floor and land in a position that that is strong, elbows and knees generally, that's going to enable them to take the next step of the journey, which is the ground wrestle. And it's some of the wrestling technique that people talk about. A lot of people talk about wrestling training in rugby league from a defensive perspective, and a large part of it is from a defensive perspective. But there's also a significant part, certainly for us, in and around how can we create quick play the balls, because that allows us to build momentum. Quick play the balls are very difficult to set your defensive line and have stability in the opponent's defensive line, which is easier for us to attack. So that ground wrestle element includes things like get outs and finding ways to create space again between you and the defender so that you can regain your feet and play the ball as quickly as you can. The great thing for us is that I'm not sure in rugby union, but every play the ball, the speed is measured. So our players will get their average play the ball speed at the end of every game, because it's an important KPI for us. Then as a staff, we'll sit down and say, based on our knowledge of athletes and athletic movement and the qualities that we think affect these movements, how can we best improve each player's ability to win the collision? And we spend a bit of time doing that. And players are different. It's not position specific. Again, it's player specific. We've got 120 kilo props who, we've got one in particular who's he's a bit of a freak, but he's incredibly good at acceleration qualities. And then we've got other props that, they have to play the same position. They can't say, I can't get quick play the ball, but one of them is 102 kilos. Well, you would expect that the guy who's 120 would win more play the balls and get quicker play the balls than the guy who's 102, but it's actually the other way around. And it's because of his light footwork, ability to find the floor and create space between him and his opponent. So clearly there has to be a really strong collaboration between the coaching staff and the performance staff in how can we get them a little bit stronger or a little bit more physically dominant. Sometimes it's aggression, more physically dominant, to be able to create space between the attacker and defender before they head to the ground. Or how can we get them, obviously, to accelerate better? We work on that continually, light footwork, those sorts of things. But I agree with Dave completely. If you just work on acceleration and running hard, for example, teams are too good at defense these days in full-time environments. They'll just wrap you up in rugby league and slow down the ruck. So it's a completely multifaceted approach, but it doesn't stop us from, mainly because we value it so much here in our game model, doesn't stop us from sitting down continually and trying to brainstorm ways that we can get our specific playing group to enable them to be able to get quicker play the balls in games. We think it's a huge weapon.
Well answered. No, that's perfect. And in the gym, would you think bringing that in? You mentioned lower body power, lower body strength, but would isometrics be a part of that? Or you mentioned wrestling as well. How does that look like in the gym, away from the pitch? Yeah,
from the gym, it's developing general strength and power qualities that are specific to acceleration, specific. It's not, we're not too specific in the gym around how we're going to get a quick play the ball. We leave that to the pointy end with the skill side, and we're very footy focused, like I said, on the field, and in the wrestle sessions, a large portion of that time will be spent on finding ways to get quicker play the balls in attack, and conversely in defence, how can we stop opponents doing the same thing?
Perfect. And then regarding recovering modalities, there's a question here. In pre-season, I'm sure it's not a pre-season again you're going into, but comparing pre-season to in-season, what are the preferred modalities you use and the reasons behind that? Of course, you got very different schedules yourselves involving the travel demands are completely different. So maybe I'll start with Davie with that one on how you address that and try to mitigate those factors.
Yeah, mate. So during the pre-season period, we've played around with a few different options. We've had a look at identifying at-risk players. So that might be players with injury history and or younger players, and we have, it's based on the training load, and those guys perform a little bit less training load than our sort of mid-career professional, but we may put a little bit more recovery modalities around those guys in the pre-season, just to try and allow them to cope versus the kind of mid-career professionals that are, 24, 25. They might have 3, 4, 5, 6 years of experience with us. We've trialled out deliberately having no additional recovery strategies with those guys. So no for example, no cold water immersion. We do educate quite a lot around the big rocks. I think if you're sleeping well, you're eating well, and you're taking periods of relaxation, you could probably argue that you're nailing off 90% of your recovery anyway. So we go through phases. I suppose you could argue that we've tried to do some kind of basic periodization. We don't have a huge array of high-tech recovery devices or pieces of equipment at our training base. So we're quite limited. We've got some cold water immersion, we've got the ocean, there's some local swimming pools, guys use massage, particularly in season. We have a big emphasis on educating guys and letting them explore different recovery modalities. But then I think what's really important is allowing them to make informed decisions and finding what almost psychologically works for them. So, a 15 or 20 minute exposure up to your nipples in the ocean in Wellington, but it's pretty cold, that might spin some guys' wheels. But if you make everyone do that, some guys will leave that session and they could be in a worse condition. So physiologically, maybe it's got some benefit, but psychologically, if they've been through a torture for 20 minutes, it's probably not going to give a positive outcome at the end of the day. So we really try and empower players to make good decisions that suit them. We don't, for example, the day after a game, it's very, very rare that we'll assemble and complete team recovery sessions. We'll trust players and to go and do that in their own time and how it fits around their outside of work life, whether it's with their partner, their kids. Some guys might have church, whatever it might be. When we're in really intense or condensed periods of the year around some of our long haul travel, so for example, the first 3 rounds of this season, we played a pre-season game in Auckland on the Friday. We flew over to Cape Town on the Saturday. We played there the following Saturday. Then we flew to Buenos Aires via Sao Paulo in Brazil for a game the following Saturday. And then we're back into Wellington on the Tuesday morning for a home game on the Saturday against the Sharks. We had quite an intense travel schedule through that period of the competition there. And that's where, because we're on the road and we're on tour, it's easier for us to put in certain recovery modalities. So, for example, there'll be compulsory massage through that period. There'll be more adjustments around the gym environment, which I'll lead around activation, mobility, stretching, things like that. There's always pool recovery. But again, we just always go back to the big rocks. If we can nail sleep, we can eat well, we can stay hydrated at the right times, and then we can have those periods of switching on and switching off so you can relax as well. That, in my mind, pretty much ticks all the boxes from recovery. And then if guys like to add little things on, if they want to wear compression garments, if they like an extra massage, if they like to cold bath, whatever it might be, they can sprinkle that into their week to their heart's content, really.
Sure, for sure. Thanks for that. And Dev?
Yeah, we're incredibly similar. Very similar philosophy to Davie in that regard. Anyone who knows me knows sleep and nutrition are the 2 really, really important parts of any recovery program. As far as I'm concerned, I think that they're the 90%, and anything else is maybe even 95. Anything else is in a very small percentage. I will just say, similar to Dave, in that pre-season period, we don't do any form of recovery whatsoever for between 4 and 5 weeks. No specific reason for that amount of time. I just selected it. And really, we're looking for adaptation from the athlete there. We're also pretty big on making sure that the athletes know what's coming next. So, recovery, worrying about them feeling good 20 minutes after a session, I'm not too bothered about. It's how they feel 20 minutes before the next session is what our focus is. So knowing what's coming next, and that ties back into the way we plan our training sessions and where we communicate that to the players, I think it's really important that they know what they need to prepare for. And then that ties in with exactly what Davie's saying. I totally agree. I think the recovery modalities that we use when we move to an in-season period are very specific to the players. That doesn't mean that they're complicated or sciencey. They're not. They're very basic, and they can be. I try to give them, firstly, as much time off as I can, which might seem crazy, and there is an element of trust involved there. But I just think time spent with your family at home is as good. Once the mind is relaxing, is as good for anything. That probably goes the same for staff as well. And the best form of recovery and is relaxation, I think. As long as you're going about that the right way, of course. And then we've got everything, we've got all the fancy bits as well here. We've got a swimming pool, ice baths, or cold pool, plunge pool. We've got sauna, they've got jacuzzi, Normatec room. We can do mobility. They've got a basketball court here. I'm just as happy seeing the boys shooting hoops. When the NBA's on, they're crazy for basketball, shooting hoops and then jumping in the pool after they miss one and doing a couple of lengths and then shooting hoops again and relaxing and enjoying each other's company. That's just as good for recovery as a 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, hot and cold ice bath, as far as I'm concerned. I just think it's better for them. Same as Dave, day after a game, wherever possible, I'll try to not bring the players in. And again, part of the reasoning behind that is just common sense, and that the majority of our games are 8 o'clock, meaning you probably don't get home until 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock. A lot of the players then, same as staff, struggle to play after struggle to sleep after they've played a game, and that means that by the time often they've got to sleep, they only get a couple of hours before they got to wake up to come in and do a recovery session. It makes more sense to allow them to sleep in on that day and get as much of that 90% or the big rock of recovery as they can. So yeah, we're very specific. It doesn't mean that we don't educate though. One thing I have found with this group in particular is that we're the youngest group in the NRL by quite a considerable amount. And so we've had to take on the role of making sure we educate them. And so I suppose in contrast to some of the things I've said here, it's a player's choice. When you're new into the elite sport environment, sometimes we get them to experience each of the different things over a period of time before they're allowed to decide whether or not it's good for them or not. It's a bit like with your kids, when they taste something new for the first time and say, no, don't like it. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 goes before they decide actually it's quite good. So we'll take that approach with them from a recovery point of view. I think it's important that they appreciate what we do for them in recovery. I want them to understand that when they leave the training facility, they should switch off from the game. It is just a job. Coronavirus should have taught everybody that. It is just a job. It's not their whole life. Doesn't mean that they're not any less dedicated, but they need to be able to switch off. Same for coaches and performance staff. And that's when I think that they get their best recovery, which comes from things like relaxation leading to a good night's sleep. I think when you get a good night's sleep and you're feeling good, it leads to hopefully better nutritional choices as well, and it becomes a positive feedback loop.
Absolutely. Perfect. Super. Just a couple more questions. One coming in from Matt again saying, could the panel talk about curvilinear max velocity, its importance, perceived physiological cost, and where it sits relative to a traditional linear speed prescription? I think that ties in nicely for both codes, seeing as there is of course linear components of your game, but then of course there's due to the line of scrimmage, the way in which you address that technically, tactically. How does these curvilinear efforts sit in your program?
Yeah, I'll just touch on that then quickly. So it's a really good point, and I think if you were to get super complicated about it, we'd look at how many there are and we'd periodize them and plan them, but the reality is we don't at all. That's why I mentioned at the start, we're trying to get the players' exposures to running fast in as specific a way as we possibly can. So with a football first program, the majority of what we do is football specific to our game model. And so when we're on our high speed day, I'll sit with the coaches and we'll program specific drills that enable the players to get an exposure specific to the way they play at a high velocity. So we don't overcomplicate it or get too fancy. Whether or not that's the right thing or not, I'm not sure. But when we're looking to get them to run a quick speed, we just do it linear, just straight, like I said before, over 40 meters. Tick that box and then we move on to the session.
Very similar from us. It's a good question, and I've seen lots of bits of this, linear running, but it's not something that we currently focus on. Whether that's right or wrong, I'd be happy to have a think about that. But I think a bit like Dev said, when we try and run quickly, we generally get the guys to do that in a linear fashion. We do have drills we create that involve running quickly in a game context, and that may or may not end up having some curved linear running component into that, but that's probably by accident rather than by design. And then obviously there may be bits in the actual 15v15 rugby work we're doing, but yeah, maybe it's something to look at. I know to keep growing the program as well. It's a good question. It's a good observation.
Can I just add to that? I think this is the challenge for STATSports. The equations are starting to come out now. I mean, I think you guys really need to seriously consider putting these metrics or looking to include these metrics to allow us to make, firstly, to quantify, the amount and the type, and then to look at helping that to inform our program. So just hopefully just one thing. I know there's a lot of things that we're all taking, but maybe STATSports to think about as well.
Absolutely, 100%.
No pressure, mate. No pressure.
Sure. No worries whatsoever. We take on those opinions, and again, we bring it towards software and development for sure. Okay, one more question to do with poor movers. Relatively speaking, so what interventions, if any, do you try to adopt to develop or correct movement quality in a player? And have you seen any link to movement mechanics a change in movement mechanics leading to injury, and how best do you mitigate that?
Yeah, I'll just take this one there to start with. We certainly try and emphasise quality, acceleration, change of direction, lateral movement, max velocity, and mechanical. Certainly use a technical model to try and develop better movers. I'll be honest, I think one of the challenges in team sport is the amount of time and the amount of reps and the frequency of those reps that you can expose guys to those technically proficient models is such a small component of the overall training volume that it can be very difficult to make change. And I've we'll be pretty honest here, I've seen players in our environment who are maybe not the greatest accelerators, put them on a run rocket, and you start to think you're making some positive change over time, but then you see them in a competitive situation and it looks like you've never worked with them for one day in their life. So it can be a little bit frustrating, but I think if you have the intention to try and move towards some form of technically proficient model and you're coaching and cueing and get the player to move to that, I think that's sensible and something we try and do. Particularly if you feel that there's a huge risk of injury, and it might be better to speak to some of the physios and medical guys and biomechanists around players that have moved a certain way, for maybe 15 years before you meet them. And is it a good thing to try and overly correct that, or is it a bad thing? They've learned to move that way and that's their sort of movement signature. They've possibly optimized that. Maybe you can tweak it slightly, but I think also just being careful of taking what is regarded as a technically excellent model and thinking that you can just apply that to everyone is a risk as well. But certainly, I think across every sport, having high player availability is a positive. So if there's something going on that you think is going to put that player at increased risk, and you've got the skill set and ability to change that in an appropriate time frame, it certainly makes sense to try and hack that, whether it be on field or through maybe some gym-based exercises or rehab, prehab programming, whatever it might be. It makes sense to try and get that player as robust as possible so he's got high availability.
Sure, especially given the time intensity. Sorry, how time intensive that could be. But yeah, thanks for that insight.
Yeah, I'll just touch on it as well. I think you could do a whole webinar on correcting poor movers or attempting to. I think everybody does. One thing I will just add on to what Dave said is we get players here, not full time, but at different times from age 14, 15, even coming into the program. And so absolutely, we have technical models for the basic fundamentals there that we want to try and teach those guys. So as far as running and linking that to what they do from a strengthening point of view as they grow, we absolutely try to develop those qualities. But again, just anyone who's on this webinar who's worked in elite sport, I'm sure will have similar experiences that there are times when some of the poorest movers, I won't name any names, but I could, I've seen who I'm thinking to myself, based on technical models, these guys are going to break. They just won't be able to play the sport, and they somehow manage to get through and don't. Is a prime example why we shouldn't be too obsessive over it. But absolutely, I think everybody could and should be coaching towards a technical model, definitely around the way athletes move and run. But then also, obviously, when we come to the gym-based movements, everybody would have technical models that they work towards there as well. So yeah, I think trying to correct the guys who look like they are going to pick up injuries based on the way they move. I think the other thing is you can't do too much of that, and you can't learn to have too good of a coach's eye. You can become a bit pedantic at times, I've seen, but absolutely, the more you can watch movement, give someone your feedback who's smarter than you. We try to get people in here all the time to share their experiences and what they see when we're looking at our players, and then we brainstorm it to try and improve all of our learning. I don't think you can do too much of that as a coach. We can be pretty obsessive with the numbers because they're easy to measure and you can spend hours analysing them and come up with reports. But it's really important that that we maintain the ability to see the way players and people move and how we can improve that for greater efficiency.
There's one more here, sorry, now from Daniel, who's asking how much time and how would players train their accelerations and deceleration components in the various cycles that you have within the year. So starting from just a quick run through for preseason. What kind of approach do you adopt in this regards?
I'll touch on that. So we don't. We periodize based on time in pre-season, where variables around high-speed running. I'll plan to progressively build that over a pre-season period, and then we're very consistent in season in the way that I program with the head coach and coaches around drill selection. The reason why we're so consistent, I think that the players adapt to that consistency, and as long as it's sufficient load, yes, we modify when the periods between games change, but we try to keep that game day -4 and game day -2 load along the metrics of high speed, sprints, accel decels, all that sort of stuff. We try to keep that very consistent, not by measuring numbers, but by drill selection. I found over a number of years now, getting the coaches to be consistent there delivers consistent data at the end of the session without having to worry too much. As far as improving acceleration, deceleration, change direction, all those different qualities, like I said earlier, we try and improve those through the game as much as we possibly can. And when you are using the game as your approach to do that, it's pretty hard to quantify. It doesn't mean that we don't monitor how many accel decels they'll do in each session, and we'll overload that on certain days compared to others. But it is through things like focusing on defense inside your own 20, as opposed to games over 100 meters of the field with smaller groups. So yeah, I don't do any specific periodization around number of accel decels in season.
Thank you. And so that's and then Davie?
Yeah, it's similar. We certainly don't periodize for a number of accels or decels, but I would know what the training dosage is to improve acceleration if you do X amount of accelerations. But we maybe slightly differently from Devs, we do try and align our acceleration focus with strength phases in our gym programs. So a little bit of that kind of block periodized approach, or that multi-targeted block periodized approach, where if we're going for a more force dominant phase, we may spend a little bit more emphasis on acceleration under resistance. So again, the foot's in contact with the ground for a bit longer, so there's more opportunity to produce force. And then we may align that with more force dominant plyometrics. So it might be double leg standing long jumps rather than mini hurdle pogo jumps. So we go from a long foot contact time to a short ground contact time. But in saying that, with the nature of rugby and the way I kind of look at it is a bit like the gas hobs on your oven. You've got 6 gas hobs, and you want to have all those gas hobs turned on at all times. So if one of those gas hobs is acceleration and one's deceleration, one's change of direction, one's max velocity, one's high speed running, whatever you want, they all might be turned up or down slightly. They're all burning at all times. So even if we're looking at acceleration, we're not neglecting max velocity, or if we're focusing on max velocity and high speed running, we're not neglecting change of direction. So we try and keep it sprinkled in throughout the program. We do tend to have these speed sessions that we prescribe in the sort of first half of our season on our game day -4, which leads into some units work. So slightly different model from Dev's, where he's looking at the games and the drills to develop those acceleration qualities. We will hopefully get that as well, but we do put a little bit of extra emphasis on it in these speed sessions. Again, it can be resisted acceleration work. It might be some incline sprints. It could be the types of plyometrics we're doing, and we just progress. Think about your plan, and if we've got to use some resisted work, you might start with a sled with maybe 5 reps over 10 to 15 meters with, say, it's 40 kgs, and then you might progress to 50, might progress to 60 kgs, and just maybe shorten the distance down a bit, just like any good programming morally would. But I couldn't stand here and tell you that you need to hit X amount of accelerations in a session or in a training week or a training phase, and you'll get this form of improvement in your acceleration as well.
Yeah, that's the questions we have. The level of detail you went into each one of those questions was incredible, and it was an amazing insight. That again, I was to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing your time and your knowledge with this webinar.
Thanks very much, mate. Thanks for the invite.
No worries. Yeah,
No problem.
thanks, guys.